Thanks, Gil, for inviting me. It's fun to be out here. I spend a lot of time on Konza, and I have for a long period of time. But it's always nice to be back, and it's always nice to see people who are kind of excited to learn a little bit more about what we do. So I'm a plant physiological ecologist, so a lot of the research that I do and that my lab does is sort of looking at what are the mechanisms of plants that allow them to basically live in all of the places that they live on the planet. So out here, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what makes these grasses unique. So that's a lot of what our research is. But in a broader context for that, climate plays a huge role in basically understanding why plants do the things they've done over long periods of evolutionary time. So we've developed a pretty good understanding about climate and climate variability. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about today. So I'm going to start off and just go a little bit about how the Earth's climate system works. And then I'll talk a little bit about halfway through or so, we'll talk a little bit about just the tallgrass prairie and its relationship with climate in a fairly straightforward context. And then with a little bit on climate change for so you can save your questions for the end if you like. I also don't mind if you just raise your hand, or if you're online, just unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm fine with either way, so it doesn't bother me at all if you stop me while I'm going. I'm used to trying to entertain 18-year-olds, so it doesn't bother me at all being sort of interrupted and trying to explain what's happening. Okay, so this is a picture, and I also want to give a little bit of credit. So a lot of the information that comes in this talk was put together by Rachel in the back of the room, and then Emily Weedle, another PhD student in my lab. So a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you guys today is work that they helped me put together through time. So this is one of my favorite photos of Konza. This was on a visitor's day, probably about 2012-ish in that time frame. We were all out here. We had, I don't know, several thousand people from the community out here for Konza Visitors Day. And one of the most impressive storm systems I've seen in a while came through. And Eva took some fantastic photos of that event. So one of the first things that we need to do is talk about the difference between climate and weather, just really briefly. Yeah. It's okay. So when you think about the differences between climate and weather, they're related. The weather is referring to basically what's happening today, what's happening next week, what's happening later this year. Weather is short term. But when you're thinking about weather versus climate, it really is sort of this like frame of reference. So things happening with weather are typically referring to these short-term conditions for the most part. Anything that you're getting from the news, anything you're getting from your online predictions, anything that's happening within a given year for the most part, you can think about as being weather. When I think about weather too, I'm normally thinking about temperature and precipitation. So you can think about some other variables, humidity, pressure, wind speed, and things like that. But the two main ones for the most part are temperature and precipitation. Those are the ones that I tend to be thinking about. So whenever anybody says like this particular event on this particular day that's happening kind of in real time, you can't really attribute that to climate. Climate is the accumulation of processes happening through time in a big, broader context. Those are just weather events. And so those weather events and changes in weather events can be indicative of regional patterns and interannual variability, but it's hard to prescribe them to anything more than that. But as these patterns develop through time, you have some perspective on climate. And those perspectives on climate through time tend to be sort of long-term. This gets defined in different ways, but one of the classic sort of benchmarks for starting to think about climate is when you have roughly several decades worth of information. So somewhere in the neighborhood of like 30 years of continuous weather data gives you some perspective on the climate for any given region. And so that's what I tend to think about when I'm thinking about climate. You can also have long and short-term cycles associated with climate. Really good examples of this that you're all familiar with are El Nino and La Nina years, periodic climate anomalies that are understood based on just natural processes happening on the planet. And these things tend to oscillate through time. You can have really long oscillations in climate cycles, and those are associated with Milankovitch cycles. And those have to do with a few sort of key features about that are unique to Earth and its orbit. And I'll talk about that kind of briefly as we go on.
So you align weather with temperature and precipitation. What would you align climate with?
Climate is the same thing. It's weather and precipitation trends through time. It's a scale thing. So when you're talking about weather, you're talking about the scale of a temporal reference. And climate is the same thing. It tends to mostly just be precipitation trends and temperature, but it's associated with averaging those over much longer periods of time to gain a perspective through time. So that's really the difference between climate and weather, is that perspective through time. Short-term events versus long-term events. So what drives a bunch of these patterns? The easiest thing is a few unique attributes about our planet. And it has to do with the fact that our Earth is on an axis tilt of 23.5 degrees. So the fact that the Earth basically sits on an axis, and then the tilt of that axis is at a unique position. As it moves around the sun, that tilt remains the same. And this is what drives our seasons. And so the seasonality is based on a function of this tilt. And so as it goes around the sun, this is something that we're all familiar with. Here in the northern hemisphere, the northern hemisphere is closest to the sun in the summer, which drives our summer seasons, and it's farthest away in winter, which drives our cold seasons here in the northern hemisphere. You work, I do a lot of research in South Africa. When you go to the southern hemisphere, of course, the seasons are flipped. So their summer months are December, January, Feb, and then their winter is the opposite. And so it just has to do with the tilt of the axis as it goes around the sun. And that's what sort of drives basically the seasonality. But when we think a little bit broader about the Earth's climate patterns, we can think of it as being driven basically by two different things. And this first one is, in my opinion, probably one of the most important, but it has to deal with this intensity of solar radiation striking different portions of the Earth. So that, along with aspects about our atmosphere and our Earth and the ocean circulation patterns, really do drive a lot of our sort of climate anomalies. So this first one, thinking about changes in radiation, I like this pictorial because it describes this pretty well. So the direct solar radiation is what causes certain portions of the planet to be warmer than others. And there's a few key reasons why this happens. And so you think about, we have our Earth over here, we have it tilted at 23.5 degrees. And so in this case, this would probably be in this way that this is currently being shown. This would be in December, January-ish, the way that this is shown right now. But the sunlight, as it comes in, it's that direct radiation strikes the tropical regions of the planet, basically such that it has a smaller area with that radiation being condensed. So you have more energy striking the Earth in a shorter, basically, portion of the planet. And as it strikes that shorter portion of the planet, the intensity is higher. Because the intensity is higher, more energy is delivered. The other thing that happens is it's passing through a shorter portion of the atmosphere. The atmosphere screens out a lot of the energy that comes. Most of the really intense ultraviolet light gets screened out by the atmosphere. And so because that's just the role of our upper troposphere is to screen out some of that high intensity energy, but it passes through a smaller total distance of the atmosphere due to the fact it's striking at more proximity. So that radiation, if you go up into a temperate region, right here it shows it striking. Yeah, that's right. So this is showing it as two happening at the same point in time. This is showing seasonal differences. So just like you were just mentioning. So you can imagine. So right now, this band is on our planet, favoring the southern hemisphere, and for the last 2 months, 6 weeks or so, portions down here in southern Africa and associated with Madagascar, and I believe a portion of Australia have been getting hammered by tropical cyclones. And those tropical cyclones are setting up because this ITCZ has shifted south. It's set up some low pressure systems and those aren't moving. So it's just spinning water out basically of the Indian Ocean over here and then back onto the landmass, and they just being hammered and hammered and hammered and hammered. So it sets up these tropical cyclones, and it's a function of these air masses moving associated with this ITCZ based on the season. And so pretty soon, it's going to start shifting back north as it gets closer to our summer. And then as it shifts back up, it sets up the potential to start circling air masses back around over here, which then sets up hurricanes and things like that for us. So, I keep hitting that. If you are in the southern hemisphere, a phenomenon, or savannas in the southern hemisphere, a phenomenon that you'd be quite familiar with is monsoons. And monsoons basically is just setting up the fact that the climate systems in a lot of the savannas and grasslands of the southern hemisphere are driven, the seasonality that is associated with growth patterns is more associated with wet versus dry rather than with cold and warm. Here in our temperate regions, like here in our grasslands, our dormant season that we're in right now is associated with the fact that it gets very cold in our winter. Like we would have been doing this a few weeks ago when it was really, really cold. They don't get that cold in the southern hemisphere because of where the continents are for the most part. Most of the continents for Australia, Africa, and South America, a lot of the portions of the continents fall within the tropics. And then the portions that go in the temperate region don't go into the temperate region to get that particularly cold. But this ITCZ sets up basically monsoons. So when it's low like it is right now, the grasslands of northern Australia basically get their rainfall. But then as they go into their winter, which would be June, July, August, the ITCZ has shifted north and they're dry. And that's what sets up the monsoons that you hear about for most of the portions of the southern hemisphere. Again, we're not monsoonal because our dormant period is associated with cold. I mean, it is dry in the winter, but the plants don't grow. The grasses don't grow because it was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit the other day. Plants don't tend to like that. The other thing that you tend to overlook is the fact that the ocean really regulates a lot of this heat exchange. So far, I've only been talking about air masses, but the reality is that a lot of our climate system is set up by the ocean. And so ocean currents basically move water, and as they move water, the temperature is associated with different current distributions. So this is what's often known, this map here is often what's called the global conveyor belt. Sometimes I think it's called the thermohaline system. Is that right, Rachel? Yeah, thermohaline system. And so you can think about this process as starting up here in the Arctic. So if you start right up here at the top, you have basically cold, salty water that is associated with, as fresh water gets locked up into ice, the cold water sinks to the bottom of that Arctic Ocean, and it's very salty because when water freezes, of course, it sheds its ice as it goes basically into solid form. So you have a concentrating effect of that cold, salty solution. And then you have this sort of that water, that cold, salty water comes through the New World, off the east coast of the New World, all the way down to Antarctica. But it stays cold and it stays deep in that entire way. So this is a natural process of this water being pulled through basically the ocean system. And then as it gets down here off the coast of Antarctica, it diverges. And so you have a portion of this circulation pattern come up around Africa towards India, and then you have another portion, so it comes up over here, and then you have another portion that comes up out here in the South Pacific, and then sort of works its way back. Where it comes up and it goes from cold, deep, salty water to more superficial, warmer water is called upwelling. Those are the upwelling sites on our planet. But as it does that, as that cold air transitions into, or cold water transitions into more superficial, shallow, warmer waters, that then starts to exchange energy with our atmosphere. And then it eventually works its way back up. It goes around closer to the coast of North America, and then up around Europe, and then it starts to cycle over again. One of the things that I have the arrow up there that is very indicative of how important this is if you took the latitudes basically of Europe and you came across the reason why Northern Europe is habitable and so much warmer than this same latitude if you came over here, imagine Northern Canada compared to like, I don't know, Stockholm or Oslo or places like that. It's so much warmer and habitable based on this oceanic circulation pattern. It's exchanging this warm energy with the air masses as it moves up around Europe, and that's what makes Europe the warm, habitable place that it is today. Now, if we continue to melt out all the ice in the Arctic, and we no longer are setting the stage for this cold air mass or the cold water masses that start here and begin this process, you can shut this off. Through paleo time, we know that this conveyor system has not always looked like this. As we went through massive changes on the planet, it doesn't always flow like this. And if we did this, and we turned off the global conveyor belt system, Europe basically has the potential of going into a big freeze, because this is exchanging so much warm energy with the atmosphere that sets the whole climate system for all of Europe. So this can be turned off. And it can be turned off if we melt all the ice in the Arctic, and we no longer are setting this stage for cold, salty water to sink down to the bottom. Now, for one parcel of water to do this entire thing, it's a long period of time. I want to say, if you were to take a cubic, a cubic amount of water, and then take and look at how long it took to do this long trip, I want to say it's around 1,000 years. So super short on geologic time, but really long based on our lifespans. So it's not fast, but it's super important for studying the climate system of our planet. You hanging in there with me? I promise we're going to get to more grassy stuff here in a minute. But these patterns of both ocean currents and air masses are what sets basically the different climate zones of our planet. And so these different climate zones of our planet tend to basically be somewhat predictable based on these two things that I went over, air masses and oceanic currents. And when we think about like Hadley cells and these ITCZs, it starts to set up why we have deserts, where we have them on the planet, both in the northern and southern hemisphere. So we have the Sahara, of course, up here closer to the Tropic of Cancer. And then we have the mid-desert, and then we have the other deserts that are associated with the west coast of South America, and then it's covered up here. But of course, Australia is set right basically in that. I can go back. Maybe. Following that same sort of latitudinal line right here. But a lot of our deserts are set up based on these air circulation and ocean circulation patterns that are associated with all of these concepts we went over. So ITCZ and air masses, as well as these oceanic currents associated with that global conveyor belt. So it tends to really influence which ecosystems are where on the planet, the amount of rainfall they get, and the temperatures that they experience based on different seasons. So once upon a time, a lot of the vegetation and biomes on the planet were predicted. Early like phytogeographers or people who like explored the globe and wanted to understand why does this ecosystem occur where it is, made all of their predictions based on just rainfall and temperature. And it works pretty well for a lot of ecosystems, mapping them out. So for any given amount of rainfall at any given temperature, you can be like, well, if you have a lot of rainfall and it tends to be a very warm environment, it's going to be a tropical rainforest. If you have a lot of rainfall, but it's a cooler environment, it'll be a temperate rainforest, like up around Seattle. And so you can start to think about as you go through these different environments. But for grasslands and savannas, it doesn't work that well because it takes more than just rainfall and temperature to sort of influence what our biome is going to be. So we tend to fall in this area over here where precipitation can tend to be a little bit lower. And you can have a huge gradient, basically, of temperature in this zone they call an uncertain ecosystem that's associated with our tallgrass prairie, low-veld savannas of South Africa, the pampas of Argentina. And so those grassland sites tend to be a little bit more difficult to predict because it's not, that ecosystem is not entirely structured based on climate. And the reason why are things that you're familiar with from going through this class, and it has to do with fire and then large mammals like grazing animals. And so the fact that fire and grazing animals basically play such a huge role in addition with climate to dictating what kind of an ecosystem is going to exist in different places. So based on things like this, let's shift into thinking a little bit about what we have going on here in the Great Plains. So here in the Great Plains, here's some maps of precipitation and temperature.
that you can think about as impacting here the central portion of the United States. And you can see there's a huge north-south gradient for temperature, and there's also a very large east-west gradient associated with rainfall. So wetter in the east and drier in the west, and then north-south for temperature. And based on these patterns, you can think about productivity. Remember, these are our two main climate parameters, temperature and precipitation. These are very important for predicting growth and the functioning of grassland systems. They just can't predict with all accuracy without taking into account fire and large grazers. But there's a really good relationship spatially. So this is a paper that came out quite a while ago in 1988. It was led by Osvaldo Sola, who at the time, I think was at Colorado State. He's still a very influential ecologist today. But he showed this really nice relationship in grasslands of North America that as you increase rainfall, you increase production. This tight relationship that we can still see today that on a spatial extent really works well. So you go from your dry grasslands like shortgrass steppes in Colorado to your wetter grasslands like maybe tallgrass prairies of Illinois, you could think of as being over on this side. And you get this nice relationship. Production, of course, here is thinking about the amount of vegetative material that is produced. So amount of vegetative material in grams per some area basis meter squared, and it tends to be per year. So you can think about it, the amount of basically of forage that is being produced in any given location through time. This relationship at any given site, though, tends to break down. And it tends to break down because one thing that is associated with grasslands is the fact that we have this interannual variability in climate. I assume most of you have lived here. You all live here. Nobody's traveling in for this, I can't imagine. But you are, I'm sure, aware of how the weather here changes from year to year to year to year. You never know what you're going to get. But that interannual climate variability drives interannual production variability, drives changes basically in how much biomass is going to be produced in one year, which gets back to that ecosystem's uncertain. You never really know what you're going to get for a variety of reasons. Ecological reasons like fire and grazing, as well as climate regions like variability. This high interannual variability that we see around here is not unique to Kansas. This tends to hold for most of the major grassland regions of the world. So here's a map from a few years ago. They're plotting out basically how much variability, how much year-to-year difference is there in the amount of green biomass that gets produced. And the areas with the most variability are associated with this red color scheme, and you can see that they tend to be associated with regions of the planet where grasslands are. So the northern portions of Australia, major savannas of South America, major savanna regions of Africa, the Great Plains regions in North America, etc. So this gets at the unique aspects of grasslands that are a function of where they are on the planet, and as a function of this climate variability that we've been talking about, which then causes ecological or vegetative variability in growth. And so these things all tend to go hand in hand. Whenever you talk, though, about variability, you have to, sometimes it's really useful to see these long-term records shown with a little bit more detail. I believe Eva Horn put this figure together. I didn't put this together. I think Eva did. And I really like this one. But it shows, this figure basically shows droughts and deluges through time. So on this axis over here, our left y-axis, is something called the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And what this index is showing basically is it's normalizing relationships so that you have what you could consider to be an average condition, which would line here in the middle focused on 0. Beneath, we're getting at basically years where the climate system was such that it was a drought or not a drought, and what was the intensity of that drought. When you go above the 0 line, it's the opposite. Was it a wet year? How wet was it? Was it an anomalously wet year? So this Palmer Drought Severity Index is sort of a regulator of that. And if you go back over the past 100 years or so, you can see these patterns through time. And this sort of tells us the things that we all know, that in our climate system here in the Great Plains, we have anomalously wet years, we have anomalously dry years. Some of these will be familiar to you. 2011 and 12 were really warm years. This isn't plotted out to 2018. Here in Kansas, 2018 was also a drought year that dropped down here close to what would be considered an extreme drought associated with this Palmer Drought Severity Index. But the point I'm trying to make is we have a naturally variable climate system. And that is something that we have here, but it's unique to a lot of the grasslands worldwide.
I'm wondering if there is a chicken and egg effect, like is the interannual variability in the weather the chicken and the egg is the grasslands, or do the grasslands also contribute to these areas having variable weather?
Yeah, so the climate and climate systems of Earth are so big that it's very easy to just think to yourself, well, it can't possibly be that the vegetation can change the climate. But the answer is it can. And so you're getting at a good example of this. A good regional example for us for how vegetation changes climate systems is for the past 50 years, we've been planting corn in western Kansas using the Ogallala aquifer to irrigate that corn. Corn should not grow in western Kansas. It's way too dry for corn. But by using the Ogallala and doing that, the corn then recycles that water back up in the atmosphere, and western Kansas now gets more rain than it did 50 to 70 years ago because of the increased evapotranspiration dynamics of planting corn in a region that is inherently dry. So plants can change local climate systems to a small degree. In terms of where grasslands are and how they're impacting the climate systems, there is a little bit of that happening. There are unique aspects about it. The fact that they stay in a grassland, if you removed fire and you removed grazers, most grasslands would transition into a woodland if they have enough rain. And when you transition into a woodland, trees and woody plants use more water, they recycle more of that water back up into the atmosphere, like that corn example, and it would potentially change the climate system. Grasslands use less water, they're a little bit more variable, and they tend to keep that climate system in a slightly more arid state than it would be if it actually transitioned into a forest. So there is a little bit of a back and forth effect. For the most part, the climate system sets a template for where these grasslands are going to occur, but then the grasslands tend to reinforce it so it doesn't move out. With this type of variability up and down, wet, you're dry, wet, you're drier. If you're a forest, this is bad news. Because if you're a grass and you desiccate, who cares? You'll just keep your meristems below ground, you'll come back next year and you'll try again. If you're a forest and you start to go through all of these big events, your stem dies because your meristems are held above. Meristems are the growing points of plants. They're held above ground. They just desiccated. You can't recover from that. And so when you start to have big drought effects, then that sets up big wildfires like have been happening in California and Colorado and all over the place. So if you're in a variable ecosystem like this, it doesn't tend to support forests because it's hard for forests to recover from these big drought effects, but grasslands can, part of the unique physiology of grass. So our local precipitation is influenced very significantly by the Rocky Mountains. So having that rain shadow effect associated with air masses coming over the Rocky Mountains, they're then devoid basically of moisture all the way until you get to basically somewhere around Russell or Salina, and then then that rainfall tends to increase again. It's also set up based on where our continental circulation patterns happen as a function of season. And the fact that we get almost all of our moisture in our summer periods coming up from the Gulf. So it comes up from the Gulf and then rains out. But in our colder winter months, it's air mass movements through from the Arctic down through Canada. So we're getting differential air masses as a function of season. But the dryness, that east to west gradient, is really set up by the Rocky Mountains. You're exactly right. Okay, I got a couple more slides and then I have some climate change predictions. And then that's what I have for you guys. So we live in a naturally variable climate. I mentioned at the very start of this, though, we have predictable variability in our climate system. So the last slide was just 100 years. And in terms of climate, that's pretty short, 100-year period. I said somewhere in this 20 to 30 year range is what we normally think about as the minimum for understanding changes in climate. Climate systems on our planet normally are set up over much longer periods of time. And we have naturally variable climate systems that have been occurring on Earth for as long as we've been able to back calculate these through time, which at this point in time is several million years. So we've got a pretty good, and this isn't models, this is using paleoproxies to understand what the gas concentrations were in the atmosphere at different points in time, and we've now pushed this back several million years. Again, not models, measured data. But the reason why we have a naturally variable climate system here on Earth is set up in 3 different ways. These are what's called these Milankovitch cycles that I was talking about before. You have a change in eccentricity, like the shape of this path around the sun changes for our planet. Still does its full rotation, each, one rotation per year, but the shape of that changes through time. You have a slight change in that how much of a tilt that the Earth has. It has this slight tilt through time. And in addition, as on our daily spin, as we go from one 24-hour period to another, there's a slight wobble that changes through time. And these 3 things set up basically to influence the climate system of the Earth. So this has taken us back 800,000 years, and here's our carbon dioxide concentration over here on the left y-axis. But these peaks and valleys through time are glacial interglacial cycles. And these glacial interglacial cycles are set up by those 3 phenomena on the previous slide. Change in the path around the sun, the slight tilt difference that occurs through time, and then that Earth's wobble. That's what sets up glacial interglacial cycles that happen with some predictability. So when you're in a glacial event, this would be low carbon dioxide concentrations down here. Carbon dioxide is absorbed basically into the ocean, so then it's in a low concentration in our atmosphere. And so then when that happens too, it's a cooling effect. And so that's at a glacial maximum. Interglacials are up here and are associated with warmer events. The ocean tends to warm, CO2 leaves because it can't hold all of that CO2 anymore, goes back up into the atmosphere, and then that sets up basically an accelerated greenhouse effect and warms the planet. And so you can see these predictable cycles that happen through time. You can see that. And so at the dawn of this interglacial period associated with where we are in the Holocene, and then of course, as you were all aware, we've continued to emit carbon dioxide. And going back now for the last several million years, CO2 is in uncharted regions. We've never had CO2 this high. And that's what in the last several million years. We have had CO2 this high, but it was associated with going back roughly, I want to say around 200 million years or so ago. They told us that sounds pretty reasonable. But that was associated with a very warm period of the planet that took millions of years to develop, not 100 years to develop. And so that scale of reference is very, very important. Millions of years versus 100 years. So how is this going to influence things? There's 2 big predictions basically for the Great Plains in our region. Our prediction is that maximum and minimum temperatures are expected to increase. Maximum global or maximum regional temperatures associated with our summer as well as our winter. And then in addition, not cooling down as much at night. That nocturnal warming is actually critically important because restoration rates of all organisms, the soil, microbes, the plants, the animals, without that cooling effect, respiration rates stay higher all the time, just greater metabolic activities, and that leads to more stress. So you have maximum temperatures associated with increase. And then that climate variability is in the frequency of extreme events is predicted to go up. We have that naturally variable climate that I was just talking about, but now we're pushing it to even more and more like extreme events, more of these extreme droughts, and also more of these extreme floods. So those 2 things go hand in hand. And so these are really what our predictions are basically for this portion of the planet. So you can see some of these forecasts associated in this slide. So this is one of the figures from the last IPCC report. So in the top up here, you have mean temperature change associated with 1.5 degrees C warming, and then a mean temperature change if the forecast for if it gets to 2 degrees C, warming, and then preset change. So then you can go to different regions on the planet and be like, is it going to be drier on average or wetter on average based on the color shading? And so we're supposed to be warming. We have slight precipitation changes that vary. So, but in general, we're not expected to get more or less total annual precipitation. We're supposed to, our predictions for here in Kansas is to stay about the same. But how that rainfall is delivered has been changing over the last 20 years, and it will continue to change. So rather than, we're still getting the same amount, but we're getting it with more extreme variability in how that's being delivered. So to look at measured changes in temperature for here in Kansas, this is our long-term average annual temperature. That's low 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see these big changes up and down in terms of temperature changes associated with our variability. You can see though that as you go back the last 60 years or so, there's clearly an upward trajectory of these trends through time. Again, when you're talking about climate, our measured climate record for Manhattan has one of the longest climate records of daily temperatures of anywhere west of like St. Louis, so west of the Mississippi River. I don't know why, but we do. We have daily climate records here in Manhattan that go back to like 1870. But from a climate perspective, that's short. That's not a ton of data to understand changes in our climate records, but you can still see trends through time, especially, in things like this. You can see these trends through time and measured precipitation change. This is a paper that came out of, I think it's the civil engineering department here at Kansas State University, not that long ago, a few years ago. John Harrington, who was in geography before he retired, was one of the co-authors on this paper. But getting at of all of the rain gauges across the state of Kansas that are in the different regions, how has precipitation changed over the last 100 years? And they were able to look at, if you look at different portions of time in Kansas based on all recording climate stations in all the different zones of Kansas, by and large, you don't see a lot of trend across the entire portion. But when you break it into decades, you start to see portions of time where you start to see some trends, some going down, some going up. But then for the last 30 or 40 years ago, we're in a slight wetting trend. But the thing that this is associated with, and that is a little bit concerning, is that that trend tends to be associated with heavy precipitation. So if you're getting the same total amount, but that amount all falls at the same time, that of course leads to more flood events. And then if you have a longer period of time in between discrete rainfall events, that sets up droughts. And so if you're getting all of your water at one time, that's not really great if you're trying to grow plants or you're an ecosystem that is water limited and needs water. So in this map that came out from the second to last National Climate Assessment, we've had one since then. Kansas is put down here in the Southern Great Plains, and this is looking at a change in heavy precipitation. So precipitation events in that top 1% of like extreme rainfall, has there been a directional change? And you can see that through the decades, so this goes from the 1900s to the 2000s, we've seen basically more and more of these heavy precipitation events through time. So this is a phenomenon that is holding out through most of the Great Plains. So upper Midwest, Southern Great Plains, a little bit there in the Northern Great Plains, and then the rest of the United States is a little bit more variable. But we've been getting more of our rainfall in these larger discrete events. And when you get larger discrete events, it sets up the potential for more extreme droughts. And so those extreme droughts tend to follow these extreme floods. Our last massive extreme drought, 2018 was a really dry year for us here at Konza, but it wasn't a really dry year for all of Kansas, and it wasn't really an extreme year for all of the state. The last time that the entire southern and mid portion of the Great Plains was in a massive region-wide drought was 12. 18 was bad for us, but it wasn't bad for everybody in Kansas. But the prediction is going forward that we'll have more of these anomalously dry years, and we'll have more of these anomalously flood events or deluge events. So if you go to a place like Konza and you want to set up a water budget for the site, this is a lot of the research that Rachel and I do, is trying to understand the local ecohydrology of a place like the Konza Prairie, and then start to put together these water budgets and think about how the plants and the climate system are interacting. Normally, this is how you would think about the ecohydrology of a place like Konza. we have the rainfall that is coming in, and then that water gets recycled back out. Most of the water that gets recycled back into the atmosphere comes via transpiration, meaning the plants regulate that loss, not it escaping from the soil. Changing phase from the soil and being recycled as evaporation tends to be really low. We don't lose a lot of water from evaporation here at the Konza Prairie. It's mostly by transpiration. So the plants are regulating that water loss. And then we don't have a lot of runoff in a system like this and associated with small events. Most of the rainfall that we get comes in and then infiltrates into the soil. But if you think about some of these climate predictions that I was talking about, with warmer air temperatures, a greater chance of deluge or these big rain events, and a greater chance of drought, you set up basically a scenario where if you're going through more extreme drying events, you're going to have less vegetation. And if you have less vegetation and you have more bare soil, you're going to lose, when it does rain, you'll lose more of that water to evaporation versus transpiration. And if you're getting more deluge events and it's coming in, huge amounts of water in all one short period of time, it doesn't infiltrate into the soil, and a lot more of it actually runs off. So then it sets up with a lot of our predictions of changing intensity of rainfall, if we change the seasonality, and if we change how much variability is happening. We're looking at changes to basically this ecohydrology of our system, which basically impacts all of the unique ecological aspects of the system. What vegetation is here, how much of it grows, how does this impact the animals that rely on it, whether the animals are the insects and the invertebrates like the grasshoppers, or whether it's the bison and the larger animals. But you start at the base of a system like this and it sort of cascades out. So having a clear understanding for how global climate systems impact grasslands broadly, and then how local climate systems impact the ecosystems that are around us, gives us some perspective into our long-term climate and weather patterns, but also gives us a little bit of a view into how changes that might be happening right now or in the future are going to shift this system one direction or another. And then understanding those shifts gives us the ability to design experiments to go out and try and measure this, and then to predict it so that we're going to know what's going to happen in the future. Okay, that's what I had prepared for you guys. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Becky.